Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm super excited to be joined by Janice Selbie. Thank you, Janice, for stepping up and being a last-minute guest on the show.
My pleasure.
I had a little scheduling snafu this week. I was supposed to be talking to Dr. Janja Lalich, who's a cult expert, a sociologist, and actually an ex-cult member herself. But unfortunately, our schedules have been kind of going sideways a little bit, and now I'm going to be talking to her in June, I guess. So it's still on the books, but I put a kind of a desperate message out. What was it, last night? I guess it was, saying, hey, if anyone's got something to want to talk about for the podcast for this Friday, let me know. And Janice gracefully responded and said, yeah, actually, I want to talk about sex and evangelicals. So you've just come back from a conference in San Francisco, I think it was, wasn't it? So can you tell us a little bit about the conference?
Yes, absolutely. It was a wonderful conference. It was actually a retreat hosted by Dr. Marlene Winell, and she's known for her book, Leaving the Fold, all about religious trauma syndrome. She's actually the one that coined that phrase, religious trauma syndrome. And I attended her beginner's retreat last year because, of course, I have religious trauma in my past as a fundamentalist for over 40 years. And then this time around, I went to her advanced retreat, and it was all about sex and pleasure, and people who, again, have that religious trauma, because we do have quite a bit of shame, in case you haven't noticed, wrapped up all around sex. And Marlene did such a great job on that retreat, and it really got me thinking about the topic and that we need to talk about it more.
We need to talk about it more. Well, going back to the conference, was it primarily made up of people who came out of fundamentalism or religion, or just open to anybody? Was it specifically aimed at ex-religious people?
Sure. Yeah, this one was the advanced one. So people already had to have attended the beginner's one. And they're generally for people who have come out of rigid authoritarian backgrounds. So that can be, in my case, evangelical. There were former Roman Catholics, former Unitarian, which is Mooney. There are former JWs there. So it's quite a wide range, but it's anyone who's come out of an authoritarian, rigid, fundamentalist religious background. Because even though our backgrounds are somewhat different, our grief and loss is very similar, and we can relate to each other in that regard. And certainly the shame messages that we received in our fundamentalist groups were pretty similar.
Absolutely. That's something I've mentioned many times as I've been doing this series on the cults since January, is that's what started me down this rabbit hole, was when I saw those documentaries on TV of different ex-cult members. The stories were remarkably similar, and not only that, but they were remarkably similar to mine and many other ex-evangelicals and ex-fundamentalists. I thought, okay, this cannot be a coincidence. This cannot be a coincidence. Why is it that we display so many of the same markers, the religious trauma, and as you say, specifically around this issue of sex and sexuality? What is it about religion, full stop, that is so... someone said they flipped the script on sex. They use sex as a means of control. They take what's a good and positive thing and they turn it into a weapon, and they use it to control and shame and guilt. What is that all about?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I do see religion as being all about control, and certainly fundamentalism even more so. And cults, I'm sure you've noticed, really tend to have a say in who you have sex with, when you have sex with them. They really want to control that aspect. And evangelical Christianity is, right in on par with that. We receive so many messages. You cannot have sex until you're married. And not only that, you are not to masturbate. Masturbating is evil. You must remain chaste and pure and always guard your thoughts against lust. And the pressure is intense for young women to remain pure. They're responsible not only for their own chastity, but for the thoughts of men. They're told that their body is like such a dangerous weapon that it could cause a brother to stumble. So they have to take responsibility for themselves and for other people. Totally unhealthy. And then young men are also, fed a steady line of BS, basically, that if they are godly enough, they won't struggle with lust. And it just puts so much pressure, unrealistic, unattainable pressure, and it can have really sad and disastrous outcomes. Nobody can sustain that.
Yeah, absolutely true. Well, the way they sustain it is by developing mental health problems, I think, in one way, isn't it? Because you look at, like you said, you take an evangelical boy, especially a boy like me, growing up in fundamentalism and evangelicalism, and I was told all those same kind of messages. I mean, we were raised according to the Bill Gothard cult teachings, which is heavily modesty culture. In fact, I just tweeted the other day, I think you commented on it, about I was reading in the Gothard Wisdom book, which is one of the curriculum that they send out for homeschoolers. And it was talking about all this stuff about when you're getting dressed in the morning, you have to be very careful as to the clothes that you choose. And it's all about gender identity and being clear about who you are as far as your gender. And then it said, I've got to be careful. I don't want to wear clothes that could cause someone else to have lustful thoughts or stumble into sin, which is clearly aimed at girls at a young age. I mean, the mental gymnastics that a kid has got to go through when you're just getting dressed in the morning.
Yeah.
And that's so controlling.
It's such a stark contrast. Summertime is coming on here in Canada, and I've already had a couple of trips to the beach, and you end up seeing families there, very young families, and mom is on the beach and she's taking the pants and the shirt off the little one, and the kids buck naked and just cannot contain their enthusiasm, and they're racing down the beach and running into the water. They are just absolutely without shame. There is such a joy in reveling in the experience that they're having, the sand between their toes and the cold water hitting their body. And they don't feel shamed about it. They just are giggling and laughing. And we all started out that way before religious indoctrination. And shame is very corrosive. It's universal, and it's hidden, which also makes it that much more toxic. And I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Brene Brown. Have you heard of Brene Brown?
I haven't.
She's a foremost authority on shame and vulnerability. She's written several books and has done some fantastic TED Talks. And Dr. Brown says that shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we're flawed. We are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. And shame begins in childhood when our sense of self is developing. And an authority, usually our parents, but might be a teacher, an authority corrects us, but they do it with judgment. There's a judgmental tone or judgmental words that go with that correction. We internalize that and we develop the idea that we are bad, that we are inherently bad. This is where shame comes from. And can be so debilitating, and particularly the shame that develops around our bodies and around sex. It just really can crush people. So that's why I'm so thrilled you were wanting to do this podcast with me. It's really time for us to be destigmatizing sex.
There's so much around it. I mean, yeah, I've done a bit of research on the purity culture and the damage, for example, that it causes, as you say, the trauma and all the issues You take a kid, that's what I was saying, a young kid like myself growing up in this purity culture, and I was told that yes, I had to remain a virgin till I was married, and that was God's design, as you said. But yet you have this incredible sexual drive, and you don't know what to do with it. So as typical kids do, you get involved in things like pornography, and then it becomes a double bind for so many kids because technically they're not having intercourse. You're looking at pornography, and there's the masturbation piece, as you say, but yet you feel shame and guilt around that. So you're praying, as you say, you're praying to God. I mean, I begged and begged and begged God to take away the addiction, and of course he never did. So now God's letting me down on top of all the other stuff, the shame, the guilt, and it's just this toxic soup it's a vicious cycle because it gets worse and worse and you can't control it. It becomes a compulsive addiction.
And with pornography too, when we have really young people, I mean, when a 10-year-old or 12-year-old is stumbling onto porn sites and it's pretty exciting, and so they're physiologically, there's a response, but also what they're seeing isn't real, but they do not know that because it's filmed to look like it's real. So then we also get these thoughts in our head about, well, I'm supposed to be enjoying this, or, oh, this is what women want. This is what girls want. And in fact, a lot of it is definitely not. It's our turn-ons about sex are so individual, absolutely individual. And what one person finds very pleasurable and they really want for another person, that could be traumatizing to them. So
yes,
porn really sets us up sometimes for some pretty rude awakenings. And having said that, I don't think porn is bad at all. Pornography can be a very helpful aid for people exploring themselves or exploring their partners. We have to be, as adults, willing and able to negotiate with our partners, which requires communication. We have to talk about what we want, what we don't want. Also, talking is a big way that we can overcome our shame. So we don't just go blabbing to some stranger our innermost, shameful experiences, but with someone that we trust. So either a therapist or someone we are in a very loving relationship with. They already know the good, the bad, the ugly about us, and they will love us anyway. To be able to share my shame, which shame is a fear of disconnection, right? It's like our greatest fear that if you find this out about me, if Clint knows this about me, he'll never want to talk to me again or have me on his podcast. So if we can cut that off at the knees, or like I say, defang that beast, it just opens up the world for us. It's one less burden, one less secret that we're having to carry.
There's so many burdens that we're carrying around. If you come out of fundamentalism or any sort of, like you say, controlling cult or religion, I mean, this is something I've learned, that guilt and shame are sort of emotional levers that religions and cults can use to control people by tapping into that. They set up this impossible standard. I was just reading this last night in Janja Lalich's book, Take Back Your Life, and she said, this is how it works. They set up an impossible standard that you can't achieve, and then you have to criticize yourself for failing to achieve it. You beat yourself up, and the role of the leader is to you lay the shame and the guilt on you when you fail. So it's this, each side has a role to play in it. So you could put that in a cult setting or a church setting. The pastor is laying the guilt and the shame on the people who are then beating themselves up for constantly failing. And so it's this vicious, again, it's the vicious cycle, isn't it? It just goes round and round.
And it really is. And when I think about the sex negative messages that we receive in church, starting from a very young age, we are virtually defenseless against these sex negative messages coming from the pulpit, coming from our parents, coming from the church, because we are told that this is coming from the highest possible authority, that they are speaking on behalf of God. They are interpreting God's will. And if the maker of the universe, says that masturbation is a sin, or that it's a sin for you to show your cleavage, those are pretty big messages to internalize. And of course, as a child, if we learned them then, we also don't have the ability to critically think about what we're hearing, or to look at what's the source of this message, of this shaming? Is it coming from an abuser? Is it coming from an authority figure? Like, where's it coming from? And sometimes then when you get to adulthood and you're doing like we are, untangling that mess of fundamentalism, then it becomes our responsibility, if we feel shamed about something, really to stop and think about, okay, what's the feeling under that shame? What has triggered this shame? It's generally probably not necessarily coming from the situation you're in. Rather, it's about a message that you received way back in your past. So we need to look at the validity. Does that even count? Was that even true? Was the person who shamed me unhealthy and immature and brainwashed?
But of course, you can't see that, as you say, when you're young, especially a young person growing up in a high controlling religion. Why is it you think that there's always this connection between religion and sex, whether it's like a sex cult? I mean, you can go back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Dionysus, and the god of wine, getting absolutely smashed and having orgies, and that was somehow worship of the god. And yet you go, the Old Testament talks about temple prostitutes, in ancient Canaan and ancient Near Eastern religions. So it's always been a part of religion. But now, this is what Andrew Jasko said in our podcast, this thing about religion flipping the script. They're now saying, well, no, we have to control it. We have to monitor it. We have to exclude it. Like, for example, Catholic priests have to be celibate, and God's somehow going to help them remain celibate. And that's caused all kinds of problems.
I was so shocked recently to even learn the history of that idea of Catholic priests not marrying and being celibate, and that it actually came from the Catholic Church, the Vatican. They didn't want to have to share any money. Like, if the priest would die, they didn't want any of the priest's money to go to the widow. And so they forbade them marrying. That just blew my freaking mind. I'm like, you despicable. Yeah, totally.
We just don't want to support their family.
Yeah. Well, and then you look at the, horrible things that have come out of that as a result of them having to stifle that very natural urge. It comes out in many different ways. It's just, it's so sad. And really, religion is all about control, and sex is very powerful. And when you look at the ancient mythology, the Greeks and the Romans, there were many female goddesses that were revered and worshipped as well. It's the Western, the Judeo and Abrahamic, it's the big three. That's where patriarchy, misogyny really came up. They say Eve did the screw up. She was she's responsible for all of the the evil that came about. And then women, instead of being accepted or worshipped for their reproductive properties, women became very dangerous, too dangerous. And I think when I look at what's going on in American politics right now, it's a similar idea. Women having control of their reproductive abilities is dangerous for men somehow. So it all ties in together. It is very much about control. And that's another reason I want women to become comfortable with their own bodies and with the power that they have to give themselves pleasure and to provide pleasure to others. I want men and women to be aware of that and to be comfortable with it. It's a beautiful, wonderful part of being human.
Do you feel that society, though, in the West for sure plays something in this discussion as well? Because we could talk about religion, and that's a critical thing, isn't it? But the body shaming and the stereotyping, objectifying of women in particular, it seems like, the photoshopping of models on magazine covers, and there's this idealized sort of body type, and that's got to play a factor in, like you say, women in particular feeling comfortable with themselves physically. There's this ideal that they feel maybe they have to measure up to. Not everyone is going to look like a Pamela Anderson. I mean, she's had so much work done. Come on.
Yeah.
you'd have to
Well,
spend hundreds of thousands to get all the plastic surgery and the fake boobs
yeah,
and the fake
all
lips and all the
that.
rest of it,
Yeah. And
just to
shame,
have this idealized image.
so true. And for women, shame typically revolves around appearances, and for men it tends to revolve more around performance. And so of course that the media advertisers have a very vested interest in keeping us quite dissatisfied and fearful and constantly pushing our shame triggers so that we will buy the latest diet, pay for the new boobs, the braces, the get our eyes done, whatever it is, and that men will be buying fancier cars and, you know, whatever they need to prop up that, that
Stereotype.
insecurity. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So really it all factors into that. And hopefully the older we get, the more mature we become, the more self-awareness we have. And that's really where the growth takes place and where the liberation happens. We're freeing ourselves. I feel like I'm constantly peeling off layers of myself that were gooped onto me by fundamentalism. And the real me is here. I'm under all this somewhere. And
It's in
so
there somewhere.
yes. And so I'm discovering more and more the braver that I can be when I have the courage to actually look at myself and what I was taught and how it's affecting me and whether or not I still need it. Is it serving me, or is it time to release that?
Time to jettison some of this crap. Well, and I had this major insight last night again when I was reading this book, Take Back Your Life. I made this connection where I suddenly had this flash of insight because she was talking about how cultic religions control people, as you say, and that's their modus operandi. That's how they function, and that's what they want, whether it's economic exploitation, sexual exploitation, or whatever combination of that. And it hit me that when I was a kid growing up in the Gothard cult, they used the fear of, this umbrella of protection thing that was his kind of main model. You have
Right.
to be under the umbrella of someone's protection above you, your parents and God over them. And if you're inside the umbrella, you're blessed by God and you're safe. But if you move outside and you rebel and you go outside, and that could include having sex outside of marriage or getting into sexual sin, you were then fair game to demonic attacks. You were fair game to Satan. And it hit me that this is how they control people. The fear of satanic attack is literally a fear tactic. And of course, as you say, sexuality is so much wrapped in with all of that. Because for my sister Valerie, I remember I was telling my wife about this last night very clearly. She went out and got pregnant when she was 17.
Right.
And my mom sat me down and she said, well, your sister Val's gone and done it now. She's gotten pregnant. She's, 17. And the reason this happened is because she moved herself out from under our umbrella of protection. And this is the consequence of that decision. And she's gotten pregnant. So she's tied it into sex and control and fear, and this whole package is all somehow coming together.
Yeah, and so much judgment there. It's really sad, and so much fear. And when I think of how terrifying it would be to be a young female and find yourself pregnant, and then how compounded that is if your parents are absolutely not there to support you. They are there to condemn you. Well, you've really done it now. You've wrecked your life. I cannot imagine approaching my own daughters that way. But 10 years ago, maybe I would have. I remember using that exact their Gothard umbrella that you're talking about. I remember talking with my daughter about that. And I'm so thankful that I managed to break free from it, because boy, that shame, and that's so awful.
Yeah, it's a terrible story. I mean, I'm glad she's recovered from that. She's left religion as well. We've done a couple podcasts. Every time she comes over here, tries to come over once a year. And I say, well, it's time for our annual podcast, Val.
Yeah.
We need to find out what's happened in the last year. We did one after the first one a year later. And so it's really encouraging. She's found that she's got a lot of crippling social anxiety because of her upbringing in fundamentalism and all the stuff that happened to her. And she's now doing meditation and sort of mindfulness and centering. And that's made a huge difference in helping her feel less anxious around meeting new people and things like that.
So glad.
It's still a lot of work to be done. But yeah,
it
it's
takes a lot of
damaging.
When we receive the programming from childhood, I mean, anytime you receive it and fall under it, it is damaging. But to receive it in childhood, so much more so, because then when you do start having your realizations that this is not accurate, everything comes into question. And that's when our identities start to dissolve, and it's very jarring and terrifying. But you still have to keep going to work every day. You still have to keep looking after your
life
family.
goes on.
And the outside world doesn't honor that grief or understand that grief, as we've talked about before. So that really just makes things so much harder.
So how do people peel back those layers? You were mentioning your analogy of it's like the onion, isn't it? There's a lot of tears, when you're peeling back onions too. That's part of the problem, isn't it? You need to do it, but you can have a lot of tears. How do they do it? I mean, that's a huge question, I realize, but there's so much work that needs to be done.
Yeah, education is really primary. So we have the responsibility to educate ourselves. We didn't have a choice how we were educated as children. Our parents, our teachers, they just poured everything into us, right? But now it's up to us to evaluate each one of those beliefs and to then be watching and listening to podcasts and different shows and read books to educate ourselves and find out what actually is the truth. Like, apart from what I was told, what is the truth? So we need to do that for ourselves. And that is true of sex as well. And so it requires some courage, even for something as simple as masturbation. Yes, I'm going to go there to masturbation. Again, thinking of a child, I talked about the little one running along the beach, so innocent. And we all, as infants, that's our earliest, besides thumb sucking, masturbation is the early self-soothing technique, and there's nothing shameful about it. And, and then, mom, dad come along at bedtime and pull your arms out over top of the sheets. You're going to go to bed like this. You better stay like this. And we were taught maybe that, masturbation can lead to blindness or insanity or excess hair growth or infertility. And I'm here to tell you today, none of those are true.
Not true.
That's right.
No hair on the palms.
That's right. Woo! Masturbation is normal and healthy and fun, and it's an important part of owning your personhood. If your partner is going to know what pleases you or be able to please you, and our partners want to please us, we have to know what pleases us and what feels good and what doesn't feel good. And it's different for different people. And I do think one small warning about masturbation, I would say, it's so easy for us and so fast for us to pleasure ourselves and get to a climax so quickly. I caution clients not to overdo it and just rely on that all the time, because then it's harder when you're with your partner, because things take longer. Takes longer when someone else is involved, right, than when you're just working on yourself. For women, it can be orgasms by masturbation can be really good because we're not thinking about our partner. We're not worried about, how do I look? Does he really or she really love me? Am I good enough? It's just you making yourself feel good. It can help with the blues if you're feeling sad. Masturbation can help with that. It can help get rid of stress, alleviate stress. It can help make you more creative. So I really want people to start enjoying this aspect of their life. It's something that you have, and it's all about you. So I don't want you to feel guilty about it. I want you to get to know your body.
So much shame and guilt, as you say, and then compounded when you put the religious piece in there. God is watching you. You can't hide anything from God. He knows you. he knows you're even thinking about, I want to try it. Nope. He
I
already
and
knows your thoughts. And then you can hide in your bedroom or go in the bathroom or sneak around. God's just watching it, which is
is
a
God
weird
the
image.
supreme pervert? Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
He's
Why
always
is he
watching.
watching that? Well, and then
Does
I
he
was
have better
told,
things to do?
yeah, I was told as a kid, he's essentially filming everything we're doing, and then when we get to heaven, there's the giant
Ooh.
screen is going to come down, and every minute of your life is going to be replayed. And, every time you masturbated, that's going to be up on the big screen too. All the times you thought you were hiding it from, and no one else knew, but God was actually recording it somehow.
It's so warped. That's
It's
such a
unbelievable.
way to pile on unnecessary feelings of shame and guilt onto innocent people. It really is. It's quite upsetting, and it can take a lot of time to release ourselves from that because of all the programming we've heard. It's really helpful if you have a compassionate partner. That can make a big
It
difference.
makes a
And
big difference.
again, talking about your shame, if with someone that you trust, your partner better be trustworthy.
I would hope so.
Yeah. So to talk with them about your fears and your concerns, and I love sex. I love exploring and learning about myself and learning about my partner. And I'm very fortunate that I don't have, you know, a lot of issues still about that. But for sure, I had to get there. I had to work
Yeah,
through
a
it.
lot
And
of
now
work.
I'm almost 50. And I'm like, yeah, I like my body and I like who I am and I like who I'm becoming.
A lot of people can't seem to get there, huh? That's a
Yeah.
long road. What about, did you guys in the conference, did you get into victims of sexual abuse by religious leaders? I mean, that's a big thing, isn't it? Someone who was abused by a priest or a pastor or a teacher in a Christian school or something like that, or a cult leader, that's got to be hugely traumatic, and that affects
Yeah.
their sexuality.
It does. And one thing we did talk about that I think is really important, we talked about how sexual fantasies develop, and they start developing in childhood, completely unbeknownst to us. Uh, and sometimes our traumas will actually work their way into our fantasy life. And then people just feel so awful about that. What's wrong with me? Why do I didn't like it when it was happening. Why is this part of my, why am I? And then they're heaping more guilt and shame and burden upon themselves. And that is such a big message that I would give to all of your listeners, that whatever your fantasies are, it's okay. It's okay. It does not mean there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean that you're broken. What turns us on is just what turns us on. It does not mean that we are going to go out and try and act out those fantasies. Um, it just doesn't mean that. And sometimes, again, like I talked about negotiating with your partner, if you have two consenting adults and you have a fantasy that's pretty wild, you talk to your other consenting adult. And if they're okay with it and nobody else is being harmed in the process, you are allowed to do what makes you feel good. So I really want people to know that about your fantasies, that trauma can work its way in there. Fantasies often start in childhood and we're not even aware of it. Um, and also even our attachment styles can come out in our fantasies. Like some people are anxious, they have an anxious attachment style, and some people have an avoidant attachment style. And those can come out in our fantasies too. Like maybe if you have an anxious attachment style, you might have a lot of fantasies about being connected, being emotionally connected to, and intimate with your partner. If you're avoidant, some of your fantasies may come out as being more aggressive or wanting to distance yourself from your partner. Again, it's okay. Whatever your fantasy is, it's okay. And it's important to have a rich fantasy life. And you don't just have to fantasize about your partner. You can fantasize about a famous person or a stranger or someone you saw on the bus. I do caution people against developing a fantasy life around someone they know. Like maybe my husband's tennis partner or whatever. I don't want to do that, because then when I meet up with that person in real life, I don't want it to be weird. I don't want that awkwardness.
Could be creepy, yeah.
It could be creepy. And
One
also,
person at the gym, yeah.
yeah, that's right. And I'm wondering, why are they always staring at me?
Yeah.
It can be good and healthy to fantasize about our partner and not necessarily about sex. It's nice to remember a wonderful time that we had when we went on that vacation, or to picture a time that could be wonderful in the future that the two of us have. When we do things like that, it can really help to draw us together. But no, you do not just have to fantasize about your partner. And you also don't have to tell your fantasies to your partner. You might want to, and then it's great, especially if they're open to it. But you're the gatekeeper there. You're allowed to choose how much you divulge, what you divulge, and when you share it. So I want people to know that. And I want people also to make sure that they're not just relying on fantasy. Women especially can tend to fall into this pattern. Instead of communicating to their partner what they actually want and what would feel good to them. And they're going to know this because they've explored their own body. It's not good enough to just lie there hoping your partner's going to hit the right spot or touch the right thing. I mean, we need to communicate and tell each other what we need and what we want. This is maturity. This is how a mature relationship works. And there's no shame around it. There's no guilt around it. In fact, I think your partner's going to be pretty grateful that you're giving them this key to your lock.
You're actually opening up. It's hard though, because I think, again, so much stigma around the whole area of sex and fantasies, and people just don't talk about that. So they're going to close down. And then if their partner isn't necessarily receptive to it, then it could become very awkward, can it?
I'm going to give your listeners a great way to try and initiate the conversation. It can be as simple as saying, "Hey, honey, I heard a really interesting podcast today all about fundamentalists and sex. And I wondered if you'd want to have a listen, or I heard some things that were really interesting. I wondered if I could share them with you and get your thoughts on it." When we bring it up like that, it's very wide open and kind of nebulous. It's not like, I want to talk about this right now.
You have to listen to this. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's might be easier for the partner to listen, to think, well, yeah, I could listen to a podcast. Yeah, that's the way I would go about it anyway.
What's your sort of approach to the whole thing? Because I know we're specifically talking about ex-evangelicals, ex-fundamentalists, people who come out of cults and controlling religions. I mean, obviously there are people who have sexual issues who have completely, they're non-religious. They were raised in a non-religious home. They were never a part of a church. So we can't just say, well, it's only ex-religious people that have hang-ups. Is it?
Oh, there's hang-ups available for everybody.
We've all got hang-ups. Yeah.
And I do want to stress to your listeners as well. So I am a professional counselor. I am not a sex therapist. That's not my area of expertise. However, I did spend over 4 decades in fundamentalist Christianity. So having a background in counseling and in fundamentalism, that allows me to facilitate some dialogue on this topic. And I would encourage your listeners, if they feel like they have some significant residual that they want to talk about and it relates to sex, or they feel it's hampering their sex life, look for a sex therapist in your area. And you can also try Secular Therapy Project. You can Google Secular Therapy Project. That's from the folks at recoveರಿಂgreligion.org, and they're so wonderful, Recovering from Religion. And you can do Secular Therapy Project, and it will list for you some secular various therapists in your area, because it does not help if you have religious trauma. Going to a Christian or currently religious counselor does not help.
That's true. One of the things that we talked about in a recent podcast with Bethany Carter, and this, I said to her that you have one of the clearest examples of why you shouldn't seek out a specifically Christian therapist or counselor, because he was actually propping up the patriarchy of this sort of biblical model.
Wow.
Your husband's in charge, and you just need to submit to him.
Submit.
That's your problem. You know, I'm thinking as we're talking about it, what strikes me about the whole thing is, if we zoom back from this issue specifically around sexuality and religion, if we're unpicking the conditioning, that's kind of the key thing I've sort of focused on. One of the areas is around sex, but there's a lot of other ones, aren't there, around mental health and, you know, shame and guilt and anger, and there's so many pieces that we have to work through. As an ex-religious person, the area of sexuality is yet another area that we've got to go into and deal with, you know, purity culture and all these other things, for example, that may have affected us growing up in churches or in cults.
You know, one effect of purity culture that I really was thinking about this weekend regarding men, young men and boys, when they're taught that, you know, it's a sin to touch yourself, to have lustful thoughts, to be carnal in those ways at all, it can almost drive them so deep inside, trying to turn off those very natural inclinations, that they almost become asexual. Like, you have to deaden that part of yourself in order to be accepted by God. And then you get married and you're expected to just flip that switch and be wildly attracted to your mate. And not to mention, you're supposed to know exactly what to do. But if no one's ever talked with you, frankly, about sex, and your partner, if they've come from a super religious background, they're ill-equipped to talk to you about what they want, because they have their own guilt and shame and fear and anxiety around it. I just have a lot of compassion for people who, you know, were kind of drowning in purity culture. And I hope that they're able to liberate themselves.
It takes a lot of work, I think, too, because you're told in the purity culture that if you are both virgins on your wedding night, it's going to be amazing sex. God's going to bless you incredibly, and it's going to be just an unbelievable experience. And you hear these horror stories of the wedding night that just go totally bad, because neither one of these people know what the hell they're supposed to do. And yet it's supposed to be just a mind-blowing sexual encounter. And so they feel even more let down after that. I've waited all my life and I've been a virgin for this. I mean, this is, you know, what the hell is going on here?
And I mean, if people, if they had the maturity to be able to talk to one another about what they were hoping for, what they were expecting, anything like that, but they just don't even have those tools, because you're not supposed to know anything about that part of yourself. It's just supposed to be like a magical thing that happens. And then that can really create a rift in the relationship moving forward. If the woman isn't receiving pleasure and isn't enjoying it, she's not real likely to be wanting to get in those situations where there's going to be a lot of sex going on. And if she is unable to express to her partner, I would prefer if you do this, or I really like it when you do this, then the partner is just thinking, well, what's wrong? She's supposed to like this. Or worse, I don't care if she likes it. She's my property. So
I'm getting my rocks off and that's it. Yeah.
It sets us up for so much heartache.
So many issues. Well, and I remember growing up as a kid, I was just talking to someone on Twitter about this the other day, that one of the times my dad caught me with a porno magazine in my bed underneath my mattress, the classic hiding place. First place to look is under the mattress, you know. I should have known better, but he found it. Well, his response was to go out and buy a James Dobson sex talk tape, a cassette tape. So he was worried that I was getting the wrong messages from looking at pornography. This was before there was such a thing as the internet, so we didn't have streaming internet porn.
Yeah.
But he made me sit in his room and listen with him to this
Oh my God.
sort of like James Dobson giving the parental sex talk, but instead of him having to do it, it was James Dobson. And of course, then you look at how it was done. It was in the vein of purity culture. You know, you've got to avoid pornography. You've got to keep yourself pure, and you're going to have amazing sex on your wedding night, and this is how it's going to go down. So I was fed that line from 12, 13, 14 years old by James Dobson.
Different, which I got a message for James Dobson, you know, focus on your own damn family. But anyway, how different would it have been if your dad had been able to say when he found the magazine, I found this magazine, and that shows me that you're completely, you know, healthy, normal, having these curiosities and these interests. And if there's any questions that you have about your body and different things that are happening, or any questions about girls and how to relate to girls, I want you to know you can come talk to me anytime. Like, how different the outcome.
That was not the way it went down. And in fact, the whole thing felt like it all had to be hidden. Of course, that's why it was hidden under the mattress.
Yes.
It was weird because I went downstairs. It was a Saturday morning. I went downstairs for breakfast as normal. And my dad turned to me and he said, you got 5 minutes. We're going to be moving you to another bedroom. Go upstairs and start cleaning your room. I mean, I had no idea what that was about. And I'm like, shit, I got magazines hidden around the room. So I ran upstairs. I gathered up all the ones I could find, and I missed one, basically. And when we took the bed apart, boom, there was this one under the mattress. So the whole thing was surrounded in this milieu of shame and guilt and hiddenness, and you gotta hide everything. And to this day, I think it was almost like a police raid. It was almost like I don't know why I didn't need to move across the hall to another room. It was really strange, the whole thing. You know, and then that's what came out of it when he found this magazine, you know, so weird, so bizarre looking back on it.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of Christianity. Well, any fundamentalism, part of it keeps us very immature, you know. So instead of your dad taking responsibility and enjoying the opportunity he had to bond with his son as a father, as an older male to a son, saying, hey, now I get to teach you about this thing that's going to be a really significant, important, and potentially wonderful part of your life for the rest of your life. So I hope your listeners will think about that and think about how they need to deal with their own issues around sex. They need to do it for themselves, and they need to do it for their children, so that we can raise the next generation, that we can keep getting healthier rather than sicker.
And putting all those stigmas and everything on these kids. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It could have been so different. And I'm sure in the case of so many kids, as you say, people that are now adults who had similar kinds of experiences around pornography, both young boys and girls too, because I've read stories about girls growing up in the purity culture that ended up getting addicted to pornography, and that became a huge issue. You know, so because we were always told, oh, girls don't look at porn. They don't, you know, it's only for boys. You know, that's
true.
But that's not true. You know, and so that's another issue for girls as well, growing up in that context.
Yes. And you and I haven't even touched on homosexuality and bisexuality and how you know, the messages that people received in church around that, and you know, what's it like when your child comes out to you, when you are, so say you're an ex-evangelical and your child comes out to you that they are gay. How is that for you?
That?
Yeah.
That's a huge one. It's funny because our oldest daughter came out a few years ago.
Right. And had you already deconverted?
Yeah, we left the church, but it took her a long time to kind of say it, and I'd figured it out though. This is what's so funny about the whole thing. I figured it out, but like 2 years before she told me, but I didn't say anything because I thought, you know, she needs to do it on her own time, sort of thing. And so she sat me down and started in with the conversation, and I let her talked to me about it. And then after she was all done, I said, okay, well, I already knew. I figured it out a couple of years ago. She's like,
Yeah.
what the hell? I said, well, you need, if I'd have gone to you 2 years ago and said, are you gay? That would have crushed her, So you had to just let the thing develop. And she's just gotten married about a month and a half ago to her partner, Tanya. And so, yeah, that's to see all that developing and see both families coming together is an amazing thing. But for a lot of people, kids have committed suicide from fundamentalist homes, haven't they? They've come out or been outed. I talked to one woman who was outed by her youth pastor.
Oh, dear.
And she was not ready to come out. And that caused a huge problem. That's a shocking story.
Well, I'm so pleased that your method of parenting is so different from your own parents, the way that you raised your daughter. No, and think of what a gift you gave your daughter to explore and figure out who she is, and then also to decide how she was going to approach you. And there had to be a level of trust on her part, with her feeling safe enough to come to you and saying, hey, Dad, this is actually how things are. And then for you to say, hey, I knew that already, and not be horrified and not try in any way to shame her, and to embrace her partner. And I saw the wedding photos. They're such a beautiful couple.
Yeah, they're very happy.
I think you and your wife set a beautiful example for anybody else who this may be in their future, or they may be going through this right now.
Well, we watched that documentary. I think it's called For the Bible Tells Me So. I don't know if you've seen that.
I've seen part of it, yeah.
Yeah, that's a similar kind of thing around, these fundamentalist parents whose children come out in some capacity, and they are judgmental and, like you say, shun them. And some of these kids have committed suicide. Some have walked away from their mom and dad and never want to speak to them again. And so we said, well, this was before our daughter came out. We said, we kind of knew, but we said we cannot act like that for sure. And I think she was a bit nervous because, we were still kind of in the churchy mode a little bit. Right. We hadn't been in church in a long time, but I was teaching at a Bible college over here, so I think she was nervous that I was going to start pulling out Bible verses and whatever, but that's not what happened.
That speaks highly to her trust in you.
Yeah, but I was the last person she talked to. But then she struggled to talk to some of our family members in the States who are very conservative, and we had to help her kind of navigate through. She was really nervous to talk to some of them. And recently, my oldest sister has just unfriended all of us over a statement that she made on her Facebook wall about how she, doesn't like gays and thinks it's evil and sinful and wicked. And, so it's still very much out there, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so sad when people put ideology ahead of relationship. No ideology is worth, a relationship in that. And the way we learn is from communicating and from talking to each other and sharing experiences. But when we're fundamentalists, our identity is too wrapped up in that ideology. And so when you don't accept that ideology, they take it as you completely rejecting them and their identity, and they can't handle that emotionally. They're not mature enough yet. They're not there yet.
It's true. In a black and white world, isn't it? Then something doesn't fit, so it's got to be rejected. So there's, God made man and woman, and he made them to cohabit together. And so this is an abomination. It's a perversion of the natural order, and there's all kinds of Bible verses. And she actually posted, it was a Ken Ham
post. Oh, God. Yeah.
Yeah. So
he's more of a turkey.
Here's this guy, and he's preaching the truth, and I commented and I said, well, according to your own theology, then you're talking about my daughter who's gay and who just got married. You think that's an abomination as well then? And so she turned around and unfriended me. So
Clint, well, that's so nasty. That's sad. Yeah.
But it's not like we were close, but it's just one of those things.
You used the word rejected, and that's such an important word, as we were talking about shame. our self is made up of many parts. There's many facets to us, and really, as we become self-aware, we're recognizing all these different parts of ourself, and we don't want to reject a part of ourself or deny it or crush it or try and hide it or obscure it in some way. We want to be as integrated as we can and not hate any part of ourselves, except even the parts of ourselves that maybe seem, dirty or unlovable or whatever. It's up to us to love all those parts and love who we are. That's one way that there's going to be healing in the world. Exactly. Yep. Yeah. It takes a lot of work.
Mm-hmm. It's a lifetime process. This is what I'm coming to see now. But I guess there's nothing but time if you're committed to it. That's what I'm realizing is in my studies of the cults. And I guess I'm doing it to understand how I was conditioned. And if anyone else gets something out of it, then that's great. So I'm really glad that you're studying this field. You're obviously passionate about it because not because you're learning obviously about what your own sexuality and your own self, but it's to help other people as well. Was there any other things you wanted to talk about? I know you said you made some notes. Did we get everything on your talking points from the seminar and all the stuff you wanted to cover?
I think, yeah. I cool. think we did. I will mention that when are you going to drop this episode?
Okay, this is coming out. This will be the one on this Friday. So this
like
is
just
the next
in a few
one.
days. Oh,
yeah,
yeah, right.
Literally.
This Sunday, I'll be doing a video conference call. I've been advertising it a bit on Twitter and a bit on Facebook, and it will be talking about sex and, for formerly religious people. Because when I've tweeted about it, there's been such a response from people saying, I have so much shame around this. Please let me be part of your phone call. So that's hopefully going to happen this Sunday. And I'll put out some more details about that. But I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to share with your audience. And I'd be happy to come back anytime if you want to hear more or learn more.
So your Zoom call is on the 2nd of June. So we'll put in the show notes, we'll put ways to get a hold of you. What would you prefer as far as ways that people get a hold of you, on Twitter or Facebook or through your website or what?
They can send me a private message on Twitter if they like. They can reach me at Divorce Religion is an easy one. And also they could send me an email, which is freedom@divorcingreligion.com. That's my email, freedom@divorcingreligion.com. Of course, that's a nod to my workshop, the Divorcing Religion workshop, also to help fundamentalists find freedom.
I was going to say we needed to mention that as well, because I think you're on your second go around. You've done one already. You're in the middle of another cohort now. And I know some of the people that are in the course that we have as mutual friends who really are benefiting from your course. So you'll be doing it's kind of a rolling course, isn't it? Every so often you'll offer another course.
Yes. I'm not sure if I'll do one more through the summer or we'll take a break and start up again in September, because in the summertime people are all about holidays and vacations with family and so forth.
Commitments.
It is, and it's a 7-week online interactive program, and we meet once a week doing a video conference call talking about what we're learning. So thanks for mentioning that. It's going really well, and I just love interacting with my participants and watching them grow and understand and come to a loving understanding of themselves and where they're at and where they've come from.
Right. So in the fall or autumn, as they say over here, you can maybe, if you're interested in getting involved in Janice's next Divorcing Religion course, we can put you in touch as well. We did a thing before, didn't we, where we offered like a 30% discount.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm trying to say, if people want to support my podcast on Patreon, they can do that and thereby earn a 30% discount for Janice's course. So it's a win-win, isn't it? So if you want to help me, it helps Janice as well. So thank you so much, Janice Selbie. This has been an amazing conversation. I mean, I'm again, more stuff to unpack. Every time I talk to someone like you, I think, my God, It's just more work to do. So thanks for that.
All right. Okay, it was great to see you and talk to you, and I hope I'll hear from you again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much. So next week, or then 2 weeks, I've got an interview coming up with Conway and Siegelman, who are the authors of Holy Terror and the book Snapping. I am super excited to be talking to them. I'm also going to be talking to Dassie Ehrlich, finally, who is a survivor coming out of a Jewish fundamentalist community in Melbourne, Australia. And she has got an unbelievable story. So those are all episodes that are coming up in the next few weeks. So I'm really excited. So thanks again to Janice Selbie. Make sure and if you can, get a hold of her for her Zoom call. But if nothing else, you need to get on this Divorcing Religion course. So thank you so much, Janice, for being a fantastic guest on Mindshift Podcast.
Thanks, Ben. Take care.